Okay, I think we can begin. People are trickling in, but let me say hello. I am Dante Roschini. I'm a professor at the Harvard Business School, and I'm the co-chair of the European Economic Policy Forum at the Center for European Studies with Professor Hans Helmut Kotz, on behalf of whom also I am delighted to welcome you to our webinar. We are privileged to have three outstanding economists to whom I'm very grateful for joining us from Italy and Germany. I am sure they're all known to you, but allow me to briefly introduce them nevertheless in speaking order. Francesco Giavazzi is a senior professor at Bocconi University. He's well known for his research on economic policy. He taught many years at MIT. He's an associate of the National Bureau of Economic Research and of the Center for Economic Policy Research, and the former editor of the European Economic Review. He's been Director General at the Italian Treasury, advisor to the Italian government and to the Federal Reserve Bank in New York. He was a great friend of our sorely missed colleague Alberto Alesina, with whom he worked closely for many years, and with whom he frequently wrote opinion pieces on the Corriere della Sera. In fact, his last book as well, Austerity, When It Works and When It Doesn't, is also a friend and a contemporary at MIT of Mario Draghi, where they both trained under Franco Modigliani, and currently he acts as the economic advisor to the Prime Minister, although today he joins in a private capacity. Then we have Lucrezia Reichling. She's a highly awarded professor of economics at the London Business School. The latest award just now came from the American Economic Association. Congratulations. She is famous for being one of the pioneers of the use of big data in economics. She was Director General of Research at the European Central Bank during the global financial crisis. She's an expert in, before.
I left the day of Lehman Brothers.
Okay, good. And in any case, she's an expert in monetary policy in the financial sector. She sits in various boards of banks and insurance companies. She was the chair of the Scientific Council Bruegel. She's a trustee of the International Financial Reporting Standards and the Center for Economic Policy Research. Also, she's a frequent contributor, among others, to the Corriere della Sera and to Project Syndicate. I'm sure you've seen her name many times. And finally, last but not least, Thomas Meyer. Thomas is a senior fellow at the Center of Financial Study at the Goethe-Universität in Frankfurt. He's an honorary professor at the University of Witten-Herdecke and is the founding director of the Flossbach von Storch Research Institute in Cologne. He was for many years the chief economist of Deutsche Bank Group and the head of Deutsche Bank Research. Now he's a senior advisor to the bank's management. And he held positions at Goldman Sachs, where we were contemporaries, and Salomon Brothers, as well as the IMF and the Kiel Institute. He's a frequent media commentator, and he wrote a book in 2012 called Europe's Unfinished Currency, where he expressed some skepticism about the sustainability of the euro and gave some ideas on how to make it better. Now, the appointment of Mario Draghi as Prime Minister of Italy 2 months ago has created an enormous amount of interest and was met with euphoria by the markets. On the news, the Milan Stock Exchange went up by 3%. The yield gap between the 10-year Italian and German government bonds shrank by 8% to just 100 basis points. And I think the optimism can be explained by at least two factors. One is his reputation, and two is his timing. On the first, of course, he has an impeccable credibility for economic expertise and diplomatic dexterity. He had a flawless international career in the public and the private sector. His chef-d'oeuvre, of course, was when he was president of the ECB in 2012, where he successfully diffused the Eurozone crisis with the famous words of whatever it takes, which the Financial Times dubbed the 3 most important words pronounced by a Roman after Veni, Vidi, Vici. And while not a career politician, he is an astute political operator. At the ECB, he quietly negotiated the support from key EU leaders, outflanking his many and powerful critics. And at home, he managed to form a government uniting right and left wing, populist and establishment parties. According to the poll, he has a solid majority of the country behind him, at least for now. He enjoys trust from world leaders. Janet Yellen, that worked with him a lot, graded his performance at the ECB as a straight A. Some see him capable of providing enough leadership to begin a shift in the EU's balance of power and ideological equilibrium between the North and the South. The second factor, as I was saying, is timing, of course. It comes as Italy is due to receive more than 200 billion euros, 4.3% of GDP, in grants and loans from the Next Generation EU program to help its recovery. The pandemic forced an unprecedented policy response to an unprecedented economic shock. The Eurozone economy shrank by 6.6% in 2020, much more than in 2009. Italy was hit early and hard by the crisis, and saw its GDP lose 8.9%. Bitter disagreements on how to spend the EU money were a big factor in the collapse of the last government. But Mr. Draghi has said that Italy must use the funds for investments that boost long-term economic growth, not for political giveaways that would add to the national debt. A national debt that has been the concern of the rest of the Eurozone for a long time, given its absolute size, and that the shrinkage of the economy is now pushed to an unprecedented 160% of GDP. The deficit also reached a record of 11.8% last year, with the primary balance in which, by the way, many don't realize, Italy has run a surplus since the mid-90s, hitting a negative 8.5%. But given the low level of interest rates and the support of the ECB, frankly, which has shielded the Eurozone from the increase in bond yields that we have witnessed on this side of the Atlantic, the cost of financing remains very manageable. So barring negative surprises, especially regarding the vaccine rollout, the government has a growth target for this year and next of 4.5% and 4.8% respectively, bringing GDP back to 2019 levels in 2022. And also doing so, starting to reduce the debt as the deficit normalizes. Now, the real test for Mr. Draghi, though, will be that of reforms. The Italian economy suffers from a series of well-known, well-studied, well-documented structural weaknesses that impede growth. Unlike other countries, it did not bite the bullet of reform after the global financial crisis and remained trapped in stagnation and unemployment, which increased inequality and fueled the populist movements that won the general election in 2018. In order to ignite growth, it is essential that Mr. Draghi and his government begin the work of finally addressing the most glaring of these weaknesses. The contents of the National Recovery and Resilience Plan, which is due to be sent to the European Commission by the end of next week, will clarify some of the actions that the government intends to pursue. What will be the mix between investment and structural reforms of the public administration, the civil justice, competition, taxation, etc.? And can Super Mario pull it off? The magnitude of the task is not lost on anyone, and questions about. For one is, how much time does he have? The government, on average, the technocratic governments lasted about 1 year and 4 months since the early 90s. A general election is due in 2023. Mr. Draghi may want to step down even sooner if he's to run for president in a separate election, which would be in 2022. Also, how quickly can the plan be implemented? Contracts for 70% of the recovery funds must be awarded and signed by the end of next year, and then the remainder committed within the following year. Can that happen? And how much unpopularity is Mr. Draghi prepared to risk? How long will the honeymoon last in a country which is rather exhausted by the pandemic and where social tensions mount? Obviously, the consequences of his success or failure will have a wide-ranging implications for Italy, but also for Europe. Might a success reshape the debate on European risk mutualization and the benefits of transfers? Could it set the stage to think differently about an aggregate fiscal capacity for stabilization and for monetary and fiscal policy coordination in the Eurozone? Perhaps even allowed to conceive the creation of a EU taxation capability and some degree of fiscal harmonization? Lots of questions, as you can see here. We have about an hour from here. I would ask you to please write your questions in the Q&A section you see down on your screens. And I will do my best to relay as many as possible to our panelists, but I need to apologize already to those of whom I will inevitably not get to. So that's it for me. I would like to invite Francesco now to the floor and to tell us the view from Rome. Thank you for being here, by the way.
Thank you, Dante, for the invitation. I know I had emails in the last few days that there are many friends from the Boston area who are joining today, which reminds me that this is the longest period in my life I haven't been in Boston for. I know we're getting close to 1.5 years. It's a very long time. Italy, as Dante said, there is a new government that was formed essentially out of the implosion of political parties, run by someone who was outside the political parties, although, as Dante said, had significant experience in dealing with politicians in his life. This government has a large majority. There is only one political party that is not part of the government, led by a, in my view, smart lady, although very right-wing, Giorgia Meloni, but Mrs. Meloni is the only, leads the only part which is outside the government. It's a government that in the presentation in Parliament at the end of February was built around 2 pillars. The first is Europe, and the other one was Atlanticism, transatlantic relations. These were the 2 pillars of the government. Now, as Dante said, there are many expectations. My view is that there will be a lot of disappointment. This is a government that will last, in my view, less than a year. At most, it could last 1.5 years, but I don't think it will last 1.5 years. And so there is not much you can do in 1.5 years. And as I try to explain, we are focusing on a couple of things. I think you can do very few things, try to do them well, but having a big reform plan would only give disappointment. However, the recovery and resilience plan, that, by the way, we just sent to Brussels very late, actually very early this morning, has elements that could make reforms possible, but I'll come to that. So large expectation, possibly large disappointment. Right, let me use some slides. From Europe and the US, this is what happened to output in the US. US GDP fell in the pandemic about 3.5% and is expected to recover by the end of 2022. So the green dots are the forecast for output next year. So we go back where the US would have been hadn't the pandemic happened, according to forecast. The fall in Europe has been much worse, 6.6% in the euro area as opposed to 3.5%. And the recovery is also slower by the end of 2022, while the US gets back to the path. Europe is still significantly below. And within Europe, a bit of the same happens. In Germany, the fall has been relatively limited, 5%, less than 5%. In France, 8%. Italy is almost 9%, and Spain 11%. And all these countries will be still below where they would have been before the pandemic, absent the pandemic, by the end of 2022. Why this? So I wanted to show you. Okay. I want to show a slide that I don't have. So this is the number of people who got vaccinated as of essentially today. The United Kingdom is far ahead. About 45% of the population has been vaccinated. The US is about 40. The European Union is at 20. Within the European Union, the situation is almost identical. There are very small differences between Germany, Spain, France, and in Italy. But I think what is interesting here is that pace has accelerated significantly since the end of February, which is also the time when this government started working. And this is the number one priority. The number one priority of the new Italian government is getting doses out and doses administered to the people as far as possible. We are getting close to 500,000 doses per week. We were, per day. We were about 100,000 when we started. I think we solved the constraint in terms of distributing the doses. We still have a constraint in terms of number of doses available. But this is the number one priority, because anything that one can think about growth and prospects of the economy depends on what happens to vaccines. Fortunately, the bad news about very rare problems with a few of the vaccines has not affected the willingness of people to be vaccinated. We didn't observe any significant slowdown. Of course, if you go back and compare this European Union with the US and UK, and you look at the casualties related to the pandemic, of course, the European Union had many less casualties than the US. So there were different willingness or unwillingness, I don't know, but different strategies at the trade-off between economic growth and casualties that was different in the European Union and in the US. Fiscal support. Here again, the difference between the Euro area and the US is significant. So this is the amount of fiscal support up to March 21 from the beginning of the pandemic. This is discretionary. So this does not include what economists call automatic stabilizer, that is unemployment benefits essentially. So the US has a much larger fiscal impulse because it has a bit less automatic stabilizer than in Europe, 2.5% of GDP in Europe as opposed to 2% in the US. And because of slightly larger automatic stabilizer, the discretionary increase in the budget has been smaller in Europe. But of course, as Dante said, the difference is very sharp. So unemployment, here there is also a very sharp difference between the US and Europe. In Europe, we have significant job retention schemes. That is, workers are laid off, but they're not really laid off. They remain attached to the company in which they were working. They go back to 0 hours, but they still have a contract as before, and therefore they don't show up as officially unemployed. So this shows you in green the unemployment rate at the beginning of the pandemic, February 20. The blue is the unemployment rate in December of the same year, and yellow is the number of workers in job retention schemes. So now in Italy, we just changed the definition of unemployed. So the last number for March includes those on what we call cassa integrazione, on the local job retention scheme, as unemployed, because they've been on a temporary job retention scheme now for a year. So when you go beyond a year, you're classified as unemployed. So the numbers have increased. So that's the labor market situation. Now, again, on public finances. So we said at the beginning that there was a significant increase in budget deficit. You see in Europe is between 5 and 10% of GDP. The discretionary increase in spending or cutting taxes, much smaller than in the US, but then you have to add the automatic stabilizer. So the first decision this government took last week is to decide what to do with the budget we inherited. And we took the decision looking at this very simple graph. So blue is what the economy was doing up to the pandemic. Green was the forecast before April, so before this government started. Of course, this forecast, you don't see a big drop because this forecast incorporates the large fiscal impulse happened during 2020 and in the first month of 2021. So what we did was to add an additional fiscal impulse, which is the red dot that you see, with the idea of slowing down over the years. This is the document that Dante was referring to. So I don't know what will happen in the future. Most likely 22, 23, we won't be here. The important thing of this decision was to significantly increase the deficit, bringing to something around 11% of GDP in this year and abandoning primary surpluses. Italy had a lot of debt, but had a primary surplus, that is a budget surplus net of interest, since 1991, since the Andreotti government of 91, which was the first government of a primary surplus. It only stopped 1 year, I think, in 2001, but it always had primary surpluses, and this is the first year we have a significant primary debt. So this is the plan for fiscal policy going forward. So this is the debt, as of course the debt jumps a lot. That is the blue bars. The debt was not small, was around 120% of GDP. It jumps to 160. And then, of course, in all budget plans, when we won't be here, the debt is expected to fall. Again, this does not depend on fiscal policies. It entirely depends on how fast the economy recovers. If the economy recovers fast, this orange line will be close to true, so we'll slowly go back. If we don't recover, there is no fiscal policy that reduces the debt. So this is again how the April fiscal stimulus was built. We started first. You see the yellow and dark purple dots are where we would have been in terms of growth absent the April fiscal impulse. So there was this big drop in 2020. So this is the 11% drop in 2020. Then with the fiscal impulse that was built in 2020, we would have recovered up to here. Now this is in nominal terms, but there is no inflation, so it doesn't make a big difference. So there was a big debate in the cabinet. Do we want to follow the US and go back by 2022 where we would have been, hadn't there been a pandemic, so more or less up here, there would have meant a big jump in growth, 8%, 8.5% of GDP this year in growth, and a huge fiscal stimulus, almost 180 billion. We did 40. So this gives us a growth rate, presumably of 6%. Now the growth rate is anybody's guess because it depends on what the multiplier is. We used a multiplier of 0.3. Multiplier is for any euro you put in the economy, how many euro of output you get out. 0.3 means 30 cents for any euro put in the economy. Looks small, but is on average what is used in Europe. In the US is 0.4, it's not much bigger. So with 0.3 and with this additional 40 billion, we get to 6%. Where this 40 billion go? The largest part in transfer to small firms, because workers are covered by the automatic stabilizer. So small firms, in particular in the service sector, are those who suffered more. So about half of this 40 billion went to small firms to make up for their losses. Other went for extending schemes for the young and so on. So this is the plan for this year. Then there is this huge European package that will start, I think, sometime in the fall, the European Next Generation EU. Just to compare it, the American jobs plan, so President Biden's jobs plan, the 2 trillion measures. So the 2 trillion are beyond what the US did last year. So these are the additional 2 trillion of the Biden plan is about 9% of GDP. The Next Generation EU, which is a bit of the same nature, is only 5.5% of GDP. So it's more now, I don't know when the US will implement the 2 trillion, but if it did, it would be 9% of GDP, while the European plan is 5.5. So it's a bit more than half the amount of that measure. How is it constructed? So this goes to all countries of the European Union. It has 2 components. One is grants. So this is money that doesn't need to be repaid. Of course, beware, this doesn't need to be repaid by the countries that receive the money, but of course need to be repaid by the European Union. So this is, we think of it in Italy as free money, but in the terms of Italy's contribution to the European budget, a small fraction of this will be repaid also by Italy, but there is a significant element of grant in this 390 billion, and then there are 300, sorry, I did the other way around. Sorry, no, it's right, and 360, these are loans at very low interest rates because they are guaranteed by the European Union, that will be repaid. So the 750 is the overall package, 5.5% of GDP. Italy's total plan is 200 billion. So this is what comes to Italy, is 11% of GDP measured before the pandemic. It's built there. So the plan that we were asked to send to the Commission today and that followed guidelines by the Commission has tries to address 3 big elements: gender equality, youth inclusiveness, and regional disparities. These are big things. I think 11% of GDP doesn't solve this problem, but the direction is, this is the direction. And the European Union does not accept measures that cannot be justified along these lines. So going to how the plan is organized, there are 6 missions: digitalization and innovation, which is essentially means bringing high-speed internet connection to everywhere in Italy. This mission is also an element of culture and helping for example, small cities and preserving culture is a component of this mission. Then the biggest by far mission in this is green revolution, ecological transition. Here, probably the most visible intervention is in the south. Italy has the largest steel plant in, I think certainly in continental Europe. I don't know about the former, so I know about Poland and this country, but in the Euro area is the largest steel plant, is a carbon-based technology, so it's extremely polluting. So but it employs, it's the biggest employer in the south, single employer in the south. So the plan is to have a huge investment to transform this into hydrogen-based steel production. So these are the type of things that come. Infrastructure and sustainable mobility, the plan does not allow you to spend on roads. Roads are forbidden, but you can spend on high-speed trains. So one of the big projects here is completing the high-speed train to the end of Calabria, to just across from where Lucrezia is sitting in Sicily. The bridge to Sicily is not part of the plan, and not for a political decision, but the plan has a constraint. You cannot start projects, you cannot finance projects that are not ready to be to start within a few months. So only plans that can start pretty fast can be financed, and the bridge to Sicily is not in that category. Then there is education and research. This is mostly schools. So if I look at the biggest item in this, in mission number 4, is essentially schools, trying to keep schools open for a longer number of hours. I don't know how much we can do there, but it's an element. And rebuilding or refurbishing school buildings around Italy. This is by far the biggest item here. And then there is an item which is important in Italy and never been addressed, which is vocational schools. In Italy, we essentially have no vocational schools, which instead are a big part of schools in Germany. And we also have no vocational program that are parallel to the first years of university education. And here there's a big investment in vocational school. Inclusion and cohesion. Here there are programs in the labor market reform always needs money, so there is money here for labor market. And then healthcare. This is also a very visible project. Healthcare tries, I hope we do the right thing, I'm not sure, tries to move. So Italy had a model in the last 10 years, which was a model of high quality hospitals, at least in the north. Few high quality hospitals, not caring essentially about eliminating small local hospitals. And one of the reasons why the pandemic was such a disaster in Lombardy at the beginning is because the absence of a place to treat people that showed up with symptoms of COVID near to their home meant that they all went to the large hospital and they all got infected. So this was the major disaster of Italy in February, March last year. So we went to a German model of smaller hospitals closer to home. So the healthcare component has, first of all, a lot of money spent on what is called medicine from home, telemedicine, medicine with your iPhone, but also because not everywhere in Italy, given the age of the population, people use the iPhone, of doctors or other medical personnel going to people's houses to make sure they're treated there as opposed to going to the hospital. So the item number 1 is treating people at home. Item number 2 is building 600 local hospitals. So it's a lot of hospitals because we have 90 provinces in Italy, so it's almost one hospital per province, but with the idea that to stop people close to home. Now, can it happen? Well, the money has to be allocated between the fall of 21 and 2025, and has to be spent by 2026. So either you do it or you don't get the money. So these are the investments. And then there is an important part of the plan which has to do with reforms. So where are the reforms? The reforms are a bit in the areas that Dante showed before, of the justice system, the bureaucracy, competition policy, the tax system, and I talked about vocational schools. Now, you tell me, why is this going to happen? Italy always said this, they never did it. Well, here there is there is a carrot there, because if I read the rules of the Next Generation EU plan carefully, if you don't deliver on the, first of all, you need to have dates for everything. For example, for the reform of the justice system doesn't change everything in the justice system. So because you have to indicate precise dates, you have to limit yourself to things that you think you can reasonably do. So the reform of the justice system has a couple of crucial things in the organization of justice, and there's deadlines. So the decree that puts this into place has to be put to Parliament by July 1st, and Parliament has 60 days to approve it. So now you tell me, maybe we do it, maybe we don't, but they're very precise dates. And I think this is what makes this occasion unique, because if you don't do it, if you don't do the reform of the bureaucracy, for example, the reform of the bureaucracy is concentrated on the reform of the hiring into the bureaucracies. We have this competition that typically never ends. They take 10 years to run, with 10,000 people running into this competition to become a government employee. Now they will run in a less in a lighter way, in less time. But I think the idea that you don't get the money if you don't deliver on reforms, what I think makes these reforms a bit more likely to happen. And let me say one thing, and then I stop. Another important thing is that Italy always received a lot of money from the European Union for projects in underdeveloped areas, typically in the south. The money was given to the regions of the south, and it never got spent, or a small part of it got spent, and often the spending was associated with not very transparent ways to spend it. Now, this time, the big thing is that the money, the first tranche, which is 10% of the money, 20 billion, will be allocated the day the Commission approves the plan. So it went today, and I think the Commission has a few weeks to look at it. So they will pay 20 billion cash. But then from there on, you will be paid on the state of advancement of the work. So if you build a bridge, you get 10% at the beginning, and then the remaining 90% of the cost of the bridge is paid by directly by the Commission, with monitoring how fast. So if you don't build the bridge, you don't get the 90%. So this, I think, is important. So that's where we stand. It's to go to 2026. I said at the beginning, I don't think we will be here. We will be here at Christmas because, as you know, on July 1st, in the last 6 months of the presidencies, so in the last 6 months of President Mattarella, Parliament cannot be dissolved. So the government could change, but it's very unusual. So the government that is in office at the beginning of the last 6 months of the president typically goes to the end. So we'll be here at Christmas, but whether we're here at the end of the year is not clear, at the beginning of next year. But I think that putting this plan into shape and starting it, I think if we do this, I think we'll justify our salary, which of course is zero, because we do all this pro bono.
Thank you, Francesco. That was terrific. Thanks for the insights that you've given us on what is actually happening in Rome, and giving us a realistic assessment, I guess, of the prospects. I'm eager to hear from Lucrezia and from Thomas. Before I do that, though, there's one question, since you've just mentioned it, by Jeff Frankel, that I think we should, I should put to you, which is that you mentioned a fiscal multiplier of 0.3 and 0.4 for the US, respectively. And Jeff's question is, why such low numbers when the monetary policy is accommodating?
Well, because these are almost entirely transfers to households, and the saving rate has exploded because you couldn't go out and spend. Now, of course, since the economy, we are taking some risks. So I think we are reopening the economy as of next Monday, taking some risk because we may have to close it down again. But so if people, first of all, people are worried, so the saving rate has gone up anyway, and they cannot spend. So I think we have to be very careful for this. And but also in the US, Jeff, the monetary policy has been very accommodative, and the CBO is using a multiplier of 0.4, so just marginally higher than what we use.
Terrific. Thank you, Francesco. Let's move on as time goes quickly, and let's go to Lucrezia to hear her assessment of the economic prospect and perhaps also the financial sector, given the probable increase in NPLs we will be seeing.
Thank you, Dante, and thank you for the invitation. I think that Francesco has managed our expectations on the government. Okay, so I mean, less than a year. I was going to say 1, maybe 2 years. No, but it's less than a year. So it's a very, very conservative expectation. So then the question is, what can be done? And I think that if I look at the numbers, the numbers, especially for 2021, really depends on the vaccination campaign. And, there are some good news, but not terribly good news. Not only, I mean, Italy is just, Europe is lagging behind, as Francesco has shown, but Italy is lagging behind slightly. I think that maybe some mistakes have been made, especially in the announcements on AstraZeneca, not being maybe fast enough to focus on vaccination of the old. But of course, it's easy to criticize. They just got in, and maybe there was some hesitation at the beginning, but now it seems that things are on track, but Italy still has a very high mortality rate, which is a problem for the hospitals. And so that's an area of risk. Now, on the recovery plan, so this is, vaccination and the number. I think the message is the same as Francesco's, to understand, how much we should trust this prediction for 2021 and beyond. Then there is, of course, the recovery plan. And, frankly, we don't know much about the recovery plan. Okay, so the areas of focus are very similar to what the previous government focused on. So what can we expect? I think, okay, as an external, observer, that what I would expect actually is maybe not a huge program of reforms just because, lack of time, but at least some of the things that the Commission is asking, which I don't think is going to be transformative, but is going to be a signal that, of going in a direction along the lines that you have described. But most importantly, I think that what the Draghi government should focus on, and I think what they will focus on, is the governance, because that's where the previous government actually hesitated and lack of credibility was on the governance of this money. Italy has a very bad record on spending money that have been that are granted or lent by the Commission. And now, given also the public policy numbers that we have seen, I don't think that we can afford any mistake. So this is a big area of risk, and I think it's where the government should put its money, basically, and its effort. And then, of course, an advantage of having Draghi is also a little bit of certainty of where Italy is geopolitically and the relation with the Union and so on. But okay, so we should not expect miracles given the time horizon and given the complex political situation. Let me quickly give you my reading of the numbers that Francesco gave you already, quite a comprehensive analysis. So as we know, Europe is not going to go for a big fiscal expansion as big as the US. Taboos have been broken, okay? The recovery plan is an innovation, and also the fiscal rules have been suspended until 2022, which is giving countries quite a lot, possibility of, of fiscal, anti-cyclical fiscal policies, so which is refreshing if you look at the experience of 2011 and 2012 and so on. But of course, you know, after what we have seen with Biden, this is not the same, okay? So this is, you know, there is quite a bit difference, as Francesco has explained. So the new package of the government, as Francesco said, will focus mostly on corporate and small corporate, but you know, there is a bit of continuity with what was done from the previous government. Is very much in line to what other countries in Europe are doing. And, you know, the only problem to worry about, you know, what that means for Italy is, of course, is the starting point. So the legacy debt that, you know, we have, okay, from, you know, long time, but also, you know, the financial crisis. So now, so my reading of the numbers, so the central scenario from the government is a rebound of 2021, which is a bit higher than what the previous government forecasted. And then it's converging gradually to a 2% rate of growth at the end of the forecasting period, which is 2024. And the deficit will shrink, according to the projection, from 11.8 in 2021 to just above 5% in 2022, and then progress to about just above 3% in 2024. Now, so this is, you know, it's upfront, the fiscal thing, but, you know, it's forecasting quite a bit of consolidation after 2022. Of course, Draghi will not be there, so that he's behaving like any politician. I mean, I think it's the right thing to do, frankly, because, you know, you know, he's not going to be there to manage the consolidation, okay? Now, what does this imply for debt? That, you know, even if we believe in these numbers, at the end of the period in 2024, the idea will be that the debt to GDP ratio will decline to just above 150%. That's quite optimistic scenario. I think these numbers, if we believe inflation, interest rate, you know, the projection are compatible, therefore, with debt stabilization and even a little decline of debt, but we are not compatible with the EU rules, okay? So that, so now maybe nobody cares anymore because, well, the rules have been suspended. I mean, Thomas, I'm sure you care, but, you know, okay. The commissioner has said that they're suspended until the end of 2022. And there is a big discussion in Europe about what is the future of these rules, because actually Italy will not be the only country not compliant with the rules, which, you know, according to which we should go to 60% debt to GDP ratio in 20 years, okay? And if we look at all possible conjectures about in inflation output and interest rate, this is going to be impossible. So then, of course, the discussion about the future of the Stability Pact will be important, I think, and that I think that, you know, the New York Times article is very enthusiastic about Draghi having a big part in this discussion, but I think what is really going to be important is what's going to happen in the German election. Thomas, I don't know if you agree on that, because of course if the Green win, then I think that the conversation on the fiscal framework will probably change radically. And I think a lot of countries are now ready to reopen that conversation. Now, of course, we can think also about the risk of these central scenarios. And, you know, the risks are slow vaccination, for example, the fact that, you know, we have to close again the economy. We can go to a new wave due to the fact that we have opened too early. I mean, I consider this a risk scenario, not my central scenario. Risk related to the recovery plan and, you know, governance implementation. And then, of course, I mean, you want me to talk about the financial sector. We don't have that much time about these nerdy things, but let me just say that the numbers from the from the financial sectors now are pretty good, but they're pretty good because there have been all these moratorium guarantees on companies. So actually non-performing loans are decreasing rather than increasing. However, everybody is actually worried about the cliff effect when these things will be dismantled, what's going to happen. And of course, there are risks because there are risks, and the ECB is worrying about them, and the regulators are worrying about them. So, the banking system in Europe has extremely low profitability, and Italy has extremely low profitability. And maybe one point of focus is that there is huge problem of doom loop in the sense that the Italian banks are exposed to their own sovereigns by 18% of their assets, which is the highest in Europe and is increasing. Of course, this is the exposure to the sovereign. If you combine this with exposure with a corporate sector, which is probably going to be scarred very severely by the crisis, and then will be challenged once the support will be withdrawn, then you can think, that things may happen, okay? So although, we are in a better position now than we were in 2011. Now, what I want to, my last observation is that where I think the real risks is really the long term. Because if we look at the numbers, okay, so whatever disaster may happen, is very likely that there will be a rebound of the growth rate because we have had such a deep crisis. And so with that rebound, in the next few years, we can afford even the kind of deficit that we have shown. Now, in the long term, potential output, it is forecasted by the government to be around 1%, okay? So this is, I'm talking now, potential output, so beyond the 2024, forecasting period of the government. Productivity growth is stable at 0.5%. So the government itself is not expecting that the recovery plan will have a big effect on productivity. So, with the implicit interest rate of 2%, so if you do back of the envelope calculation, then even without pricing the risk that I have talked about, so we would have to have a primary deficit of 0, and but this is really being on the, very, very conservative on the risk and so on. So so I think that even forgetting about the rules, but just talking about that stabilization, which is a less severe requirement, I think we are on a very kind of edgy situation. So where, risk premium may materialize, and we can't expect the ECB to be there just for Italy, of course. So I think that we really need a miracle in terms of, boosting productivity. And I don't believe in miracles. So I think we need some solution, okay? And the solution, I think, would probably be, to have a very long-term horizon and negotiate something which would allow us to have some, slow consolidation over the next decades. I think Italy is not going to be the only country in the EU to find itself in this situation, but we're probably, the one in the riskiest situation. Okay, so this is what I have to say about the numbers, and and that's all. So good luck to Draghi, but I hear that he's not going to be here for long. So good luck to the next ones then. Thank you.
Thank you, Lucrezia, for this, I think, sobering overview of the numbers and of the prospects for the economy here. On the point of the length of the duration of the government, Jeffrey again is asking Francesco, why such pessimism and why such short time frame that you mentioned, especially given the strong support that Draghi currently enjoys. Can you just go back to that?
I think there are institutional constraints. So a new president will be elected in January next year. The tradition is that when a new president is elected, the prime minister offers his resignation. Now, it may be accepted, may not be accepted, depends on who the president will be. So there is an obvious fixed point, which is January 15. the president may ask Draghi to continue. In that case, he would continue until May 23. But I think there is a strong argument for not waiting till 23. I mean, this will be a year after a new president is elected, will be a year of essentially a political campaign that lasts for 15 months. It is not obvious whether you want to have a 15-month long political campaign or just have a 3-month political campaign and vote in the spring. So these are the reasons that make me cautious about the land.
Right. Thank you very much, Francesco. Okay, now let's go to someone I'm sure is going to be enthusiastic about the prospects for Italy and hear what is the view from the north, I suppose, about the Draghi government and the prospects for change going forward in Italy. Thomas, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you, Dante, and thank you for having me. I would like to start with a quote. And I would like to show it to you. So therefore, I will now share my screen.
Perfect.
This is a quote from Mr. Draghi's predecessor at the ECB, Jean-Claude Trichet. And it comes from a book that was just published 2 months ago with the title, The Value of Money. And it is about economic cultures in Europe. And it focuses on Italy and Germany. And it contributes about more than 20 essays of economists, Germans, Italians, and Europeans. And Mr. Trichet has volunteered the preface to it. And I think he makes a very important point. In his preface, he says that there is a problem with regard to the economic models that the participants pursue. And he boils it down very much focused on a northern and a southern model, and Germany stands for the northern and Italy for the southern model. And his point is that Italy has had a tendency towards an economic model that is inward-looking, not really focusing on the outside, not really focusing on international competitiveness. And the result, of course, was then a long period of lira devaluation. Germany, on the other hand, is the opposite. It is a model that focuses on the outside. Competitiveness is everything. Now you bring these two together. How can they function in a single currency area? And I think Trichet makes a very important point. And he has two advices for Italy and for Germany. The advice to Italy is beware of your tendency to lose competitiveness, especially cost competitiveness in comparison with the others. To Germany, it's the other way around. We're not talking about Germany now because we could talk a lot about what the Germans have to do to become more balanced, but we talk about Italy. And I just want, from that point of view, I want to highlight a few things that may be important to keep in mind when we talk about now the Italian recovery plan. When you go to what Trichet is talking about, then you have to start with the cost competitiveness. It's a chart that he used to show when he was going to the Eurogroup meetings. Italy has not held up its cost competitiveness and therefore needs to find structures to improve on that front. The consequence, of course, was a worse performance as far as industrial production is concerned. I go through this very quickly because we have heard a lot, so I don't want to keep you too long here. We have had an underperformance as far as GDP is concerned. Italy has basically now just increased by 2% in real GDP since the entry of EMU. We had an unemployment problem. It's interesting perhaps to note that when EMU started, Germany was considered the sick man of Europe. And as you can see here, German unemployment increased a lot, while in Italy unemployment came down, and this all reversed. And I come to one of the key factors that may be important now for Italy to think about to get such a reversal going. And of course, we have a balance of payments problem in the euro area. These are the famous Target 2 balances that Germans love to talk about. Hans-Werner Sinn popularized them in Germany, so that I think every citizen now knows about it. It's the bottom line, below the line balance of payments. So you add up capital account, you add up current account, what comes out in a gold standard we know that has created tons of problems in the past. In the euro area, it just shows up in huge imbalances in the bank payment system. So what should Italy do? I think Italy should do a Schröder. So Gerhard Schröder turned Germany around. It's amazing, actually, when you think back to it. It started in 2003, March 2003, and he had only time to 2005. That's relatively short, but of course a lot longer than Mr. Draghi has. And when you go through what he did, there are some similarities that I sense from what you showed, Dante, and also what Francesco showed. There are some similarities, but I think what is important is to know where the focus needs to be. And when I look back, what was making the Schröder reform successful and turned the sick man into now one who is perhaps running too fast for the others, then I think we had a lot of the structural small stuff that made the difference. There was this lowering of entry barriers into the craft sector, easing of firing restrictions, reduction of employer social security contributions, vocational training schemes, very important labor market, streamlining of unemployment compensation to make the labor market more flexible, reform of old age provision, pension schemes, private funded pension schemes in addition to the state pension scheme, and tax changes. So what is interesting in this regard, that's my last slide, and I will actually also already stop. What is interesting in this regard is that it was not the fiscal spending that made the difference in Germany, that turned it around. This is the budget balance. This is the Schröder agenda. And as you can see here, it actually did not deteriorate while he was doing the job. It deteriorated before. And even though they were below the 3% line, which back then was a big deal, now it's not a big deal, it did not deteriorate further through this reform period. So what I take away from this is that it was the nitty-gritty stuff that really made the difference. And this is, on the one hand, reassuring when you think about that you do not need tons of money to do the reforms. But on the other hand, it's also a problem because, as we have heard, just the nitty-gritty stuff requires time. And I think this is going to be the biggest problem here, as we've already heard from Lucrezia. Let me stop here.
Thank you, Thomas. That's actually, in my view, the most optimistic of the three interventions that I've heard. But I think you give us an interesting recipe, the Schröder's recipe, on how to get back through the nitty-gritty, as you called it. I do recognize a number of the elements that Francesco showed us in the plan that was put forward early to the Commission. I guess there's a number of questions here, and we really, unfortunately, have little time. But let me start with a question based on what Thomas just said and the cardinal points to actually make a difference, even if the government will only be around for a relatively short period of time. And one in particular for you, Francesco, is the industrial structure of Italy, of course, is made up of a large number of family-owned businesses, small businesses. What in the plan will be devoted to help those companies, grow, be more competitive, and be better equipped to compete in the international markets?
Yeah, the tool in the plan is essentially taxation, is incentives to recapitalize firms. Many of these firms don't grow because their owners use their capital to buy a house on the mountain rather than capitalizing their company. And so there are incentives to recapitalize companies. That I think is the main thing. And then there is a
fiscal incentive, you meant fiscal.
A back of the door way to do it. This thing that in Italy is called Industry 4.0, which is a German imported name. But the idea is that if you have a small company and you link it up, a small company that produces goods, it's a sub-supplier of a large company. This small company doesn't have the human capital or the resources to do quality control. So you delegate quality control online to your to the guy to whom you sell your goods down the road, and this helps a lot. So rather than if you cannot raise the size of the firm itself, you can integrate it into a chain and use the link with the following part of the chain. And this has worked in the Northeast. Has worked very well. There are studies that show that small firms that have been integrated in these chains have improved productivity a lot, while those that have not done this have remained behind. So there are things. But I agree with both Lucrezia and Thomas that the crucial element of this plan is reforms. We are not going to change Italy by speeding up the time it takes to go to Calabria from Naples, although this will be done. Within reforms, Thomas was right. You have to do the nitty-gritty. You have to identify small things and do the small things. First of all, because it gives you credibility. So if you can, for example, this new justice minister, who is a very smart lady, she was the president of the Constitutional Court before becoming a minister, and she's a colleague in my university. Well, she did one thing. She's going to do one thing essentially. She's going to be what's called the Office of the Judiciary Proceeding. So one reason why proceedings in Italy take forever is that the judge often disappears, he moves elsewhere, he retires, and the court case essentially disappears with the judge. Now here instead, she's going to create in each court these offices and a proceeding. I don't know if the proceeding is the right word, but is given to an office which is responsible for that case all the way to the end, independently of whether the judge changes 10 times, which is likely. Very small thing, but this could have, I know nothing about the justice system, but the minister who knows more than me thinks it works. The reform of the competition, there are national competition to enter the public sector, in any public sector from the small town to ministry may help. Maybe these are dreams of the new minister who is a very innovative, and innovative is not the right word, it's a very lively minister. But maybe it will work, and this will speed up the change in the, so small thing. I agree with you that if we're not able to do small things, nothing will happen. For example, there's one measure that I'll tell you that I insisted, I will not get me many friends. The way head of medical departments in hospital are appointed is that there is a committee that selects a short list of, I don't know, and names of doctors who are qualified to become head of the medical department. And then the director general of the hospital, who is typically a politician, chooses them on the list. But the law doesn't say that the lady or the man who runs the hospital must choose the first in the list. And if the first doesn't want, he can choose the last one. Now, this, of course, results in a head of medical department, meaning typically appointed on political allegiance rather than merit. So now the thing says it's a one-line thing. You have to appoint the first, and if the guy doesn't accept, go to the second, but go down the list. It's a small thing, but I think it could make a difference.
Well, on that front, let me ask you this, many questions. One of them comes from our Consul General here, actually. And the concern is about the young people, the brain drain and the way that the youth sees the future, of course. High unemployment, as we know, and youth unemployment, a very big disparity between the North and South from that perspective, an educational system that is not necessarily geared to the needs of the industrial system. What can you say about what the government is thinking about in order to reignite some confidence in the people that will run the country in the future?
Again, Lucrezia and I were used, at least me, until a little time ago, and Lucrezia continues to write op-eds in Italian newspapers with wonderful ideas how to address this. And Lucrezia, for sure, keeps doing this. As I said, we have a few months, so what can you do? For example, what I thought was useful is I have this idea that in a village, in a town, the school must be the house of the kids who attend the school. Schools in Italy close too early. At 2 o'clock, they close down, and the kids are out on the street until the evening because maybe at home the parents are working, there's nobody at home. So why shouldn't school be open until 6 so they can stay and do activities? So there is part of all this money that I said there is an investment in refurbishing school and also putting in places for sport activities. There is almost no sports in Italian schools. So sport activities, and I think you don't need to build a swimming pool. You just need to have a guy who goes out and brings the kids running somewhere in the afternoon. So I think these are small things, but I think that making the kids feel, the kids at 15, 16, feel that the school is their home is already something that can result in a brighter view of the future. I mean, maybe it's just a dream.
All right.
But there's a lot of money in refurbishing school buildings.
No,
Dante,
it is.
can I make a comment?
By all means.
Okay. So I must say that, you know, the things we're discussing here, I'm not sure the same that Thomas has in mind, because in my view, the program of reform that Italy needs now is quite different than what has been done in Germany at the time. But, you know, whatever you think about the importance of schools and stopping the brain drain and tackling productivity and etc. I mean, these ideas are shared by almost all the political spectrum in Italy, or a big part of the political spectrum. They were in the agenda of the previous government as well. So I think that it's very important to understand why things don't get done, because, you know, it's not lack of ideas or good principles. And also, you know, I think we need to be innovative, and we need to get the people along. And this is complicated, not only in Italy, but everywhere. I mean, we are facing big transformation things, for example, I mean, the old ecological transitions, which will have distributional consequences. And so they will create, you know, balkanization in society. So I think mostly we need a political process which is solid and can go beyond this government and has, you know, that's what we need. Because I don't think that people disagree on the need, for example, on keeping schools open in the South, or, you know, to do vocational education.
People don't disagree, but teachers, as soon as we said this, teachers...
Oh, exactly. So the problem is implementation and to have the political strength to do it against, you know, the people who are hit by these changes. And you know, the question is, who is, I mean, you know, who are the kind of protagonists of this change? Okay, it's not necessarily a government, but it is a society after all. And this is key.
Thank you. And I think you touched upon this, in fact, in your own remarks earlier, Lucrezia, when you mentioned the governance of this entire reform process. Where should it sit, I guess? You know, is it within the government? Is it a body that's formed by the government and outside? But the big question, of course, is how do we then bring to fruition in reality all of the good ideas that we've just heard today? I'm extremely sorry to say that we are at the end of our time. This has been, to me at least, extraordinarily interesting, and I am very, very grateful to Thomas, to Lucrezia, and of course to Francesco to have been with us today. I think we all wish Francesco and the government good luck in all the changes that they're trying to make. And I look forward to having a chance of perhaps doing this again down the line when we maybe see what has happened between now and then. I'm sorry I cannot invite you upstairs as we normally do here at the Center for European Studies, but at the same time, I think we've had a great participation, larger participation than we would have had this event happened in Cambridge. So thank you also on behalf of Hans Helmut to all of you for having participated, and I look forward to seeing you at the next event. Bye-bye.
Bye, thank you.